Hello, welcome back to the Living Process. My name is Greg Madison. My guest this time is Peter Afford. Peter is a very well-known focusing-oriented therapist in the UK, although he has just closed his therapy practice. But he's also very active in the focusing world and has taught focusing and focusing-oriented therapy for very, very many years, including workshops on dreams and TAE. His most recent work has been, and for some years now, has been on neuroscience, including this book, Therapy in the Age of Neuroscience. And I'd really recommend the book. I found it fascinating. I found it subtle in his presentation and very clear. And I can see in many ways how his understanding of the biological bases of experiencing not only supports a lot of what we do as focusing-oriented therapists and focusers, but also gives us another way of thinking about parts of it. And we touch on that quite a bit, and it leads into some discussion of the felt sense and the importance and centrality of that concept, and even felt sensing in organizations and in groups. We also talk a little bit about the different hemispheres and how they may be active in felt sensing and a felt shift, and how the left hemisphere is quite a dominant influence in our world, and Peter's ideas on how maybe that needs to be more balanced. In full disclosure, the neuroscientific way of seeing things, it isn't something that I tend to emphasize, and the language is not a language that's that familiar to me. But I found talking to Peter really interesting, and it actually made me a little bit more open to this way of understanding things. So I hope you enjoy this episode on neuroscience and the felt sense with Peter Afford. So, welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you on the Living Process. And the thing that I normally ask people, first of all, and I'd like to ask you, is how you originally found out about focusing, got into this strange world of Gendlin's work.
Yes. Well, I love answering this question because I got into it via an even stranger world.
Oh.
In Sydney, Australia in 1984. My story is I was training to work with an organization called, it's going to be called Transformations. It's about pop psychology and transforming your life. It actually got called Self-Transformations because in Sydney, the name Transformations had already been registered by a painting and decorating company. There were Self-Transformations, and my wife at the time, my first wife, Sophia, and I had got involved with them here, and we went to Sydney for 6 months to train quite intensively, and we did a course called Being of Service, where they train people to work on their wacky weekend workshops. So 50 people in a room for 2 evenings to learn focusing. And focusing was sandwiched between some Gestalt learning, some Gestalt techniques, and past life regression. And so focusing was a bit different. And it was billed as in this very enticing, mysterious way, like if you learn focusing, you can sort out all your neuroses and hang-ups and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the only problem was that you can't teach focusing to 50 people over 2 evenings. And the woman who taught it, Helena Cornelius, who was excellent, had not been taught by anybody. She had read book and that, and she did her best. And I was not a natural focuser, so I couldn't get it. But I was very intrigued. So it was sort of left dangling. And then Sophia and I came back to England, and she was a bit of a natural focuser, and she had to teach the same course here in England, in London. So a pile of, I remember a big sack of Gendlin's little focusing book arrived, like 50 copies to give to everyone, and a cassette tape of a talk Gendlin gave in the early 1980s to a hypnotherapy conference, which talk I still have. And last year I digitized it, and it's now on the TIFI website. And it's really interesting to hear Gene talking in his younger days. Very, very alive, very engaging talk. So, okay, at that time I still didn't learn focusing for myself, but Sophia was teaching it, and I studied biodynamic psychotherapy for a year, the Gerda Boyson technique, and they have the same philosophy and attitude as we have in focusing, about allowing the body to do what the body wants to do. Rather different, because it's very massage-based work on massage table. But the feel of it, the philosophy of it was essentially the same. So after 2 or 3 years, I got the hang of focusing for myself. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer. As soon as I got the hang of it, I was practicing it for myself, and then I started teaching it to small groups in London.
That is fascinating. I didn't know most of that history. And it makes me wonder, what was it, even though you couldn't quite get it, why did you remain interested in it in some way?
Because it held out the promise of the Holy Grail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like this is a way to connect with your feeling life. And I guess back then I had problems with my feeling life, my emotional life. I sort of didn't get it. I felt very inadequate about it. And in the self-transformations thing, I got very involved with for a couple of years. It's completely insane, but great fun. I did learn something from it. It was this whole thing that you had at that time, early 1980s, of provoking people into emotional catharsis. You know, if you get out all your anger, and you get out all your tears and your crying, then you're going to be liberated. Mm-hmm. And at the end of a weekend with them, we were all liberated. We had fantastic parties. The only trouble was, give it a week later, and you're sort of back to square one with certain feelings. And what do I do now? Oh, I better go and do another of their weekends. Well, obviously, this wasn't quite it. So it was focusing that finally helped me to find my feelings. And allow my feelings to flow. And it's just so simple. But as we know, it's so easy not to be that simple about it.
Absolutely, yeah. So once you kind of got the hang of focusing, you started to teach it, did a therapy training, got involved in BFA.
Well, let's go step at a time. I have to bring Jung in here, I'm afraid, because I started with Jung.
Okay.
Well, before Jung, I started with meditation. Meditation led to the self-transformations, and also time at Findhorn Foundation in Scotland, which a lot of people will have heard of. Mm-hmm. And when I was at Findhorn, I read Jung, and Jung really got me into psych world. I was completely hooked. And then I found self-transformations and focusing and Gendlin and biodynamic therapy. I got into all of those, and I got used to teaching classes. Started with teaching meditation classes, so it was quite natural for me to want to teach focusing to small groups. I was into doing that, and it was only 2 or 3 years later that I pinned myself down and said I need to do a proper professional training as a therapist. So I went to do the psychosynthesis training in London, starting in 1990, and I was a complete pain in that group because I knew focusing.
Yeah.
And I had some very very seminal experiences. The one that stands out for me was, I think this is relevant in this context.
Mm-hmm.
We had, as part of the 3-year training, we had 2 or 3 Gestalt intensives, which were 5 days each. We were in a wonderful group, 20 people or so, and we had a brilliant Gestalt teacher, Malcolm Parlett, who's well known in Gestalt world here. And I remember he did his assistant did a demonstration session in the group with somebody. And we were well into the course by then, probably halfway through this 3-year training. And the session didn't really work. Somebody volunteered and they had some sort of issue they wanted to explore, and they did all these Gestalt things. It didn't quite work. And at the end, Malcolm commented, well, I think it's probably something to do with your mother. I think it might have been mother. It was something like that, parental. Mm-hmm. And it just going back to basic sort of Freudian ideas. And I sat there and I was going bananas, because what hadn't happened in this demonstration session was the volunteer being allowed to sit quietly with her felt experience, her felt sense, and allow a process to come from that. And I had worked enough with focusing by then to know bloody well that if she'd been allowed to do that, it would have almost certainly unfolded and had been a very satisfactory process and a good demonstration. And then the whole group hated me because it's like I'm sitting there being clever clogs. Yeah. Like I know better than this very experienced Gestalt trainer what to do. But that really stuck with me, and the value of focusing relative to other excellent techniques and approaches like psychosynthesis and Gestalt, and it works.
Yeah, I can resonate with that experience of being in a therapy training, knowing focusing and seeing where just a few moments of silent staying with something would be so helpful. Yeah. So I know that you went on for many years teaching FOT and dream work for a while, but because we don't have a lot of time, maybe we should skip to the neuroscience stuff that you've also been doing for quite a while now.
Okay, before we do that, okay. I'll just put in the other important bit for me of from the historical perspective. Yep. You see, I'd learned focusing, I've got the hang of focusing, and late in 1990, I was very lucky. Somebody I taught focusing to, David Guinness, he was very enthusiastic about it, and he funded me to go to Chicago and do the week-long. So I went over there, and what I found was that I was doing focusing and teaching focusing the way that they were. This was Mary Maguire, Bala Jason, Reva Bernstein, and some other people, well-known luminaries from the past in focusing. But what I hadn't got was the listening side. And watching them, observing them do experiential listening was a complete jaw dropper for me. And when I came back to England, I felt again I'd found the Holy Grail. And I noticed how that the style and, in a way, technique of listening was not practiced by like my psychosynthesis trainers, and how valuable it obviously was. So that was a another huge piece of the jigsaw puzzle for me.
Yeah, the listening side of it, you could see, as a therapist, you could see where that was missing in sessions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to quite specific things. When somebody becomes a little emotional, there's something going on in there. The psychosynthesis people would, the therapist or the person demonstrating the therapist's role would just keep their mouth shut. So they would allow the silence.
Okay.
And leave the person in that space, but there would be silence, and there would never be the sort of experiential response which supports the person's focusing process and that overcomes the tendency for the person to feel shame, to go into a shame state, because they're touching into a very vulnerable place, and the person who's supporting them is just silent, and in that silence, shame can come in. There's something wrong with me.
Exactly.
So by saying the very simple things, aha, yes, aha, even really simple things like that, person feels supported, and it makes all the difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. Those simple indications of acceptance are so. Sorry?
It's okay.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Okay. Be feeling what I'm feeling. I'm okay. That's what it says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And how silence, just silence without something like that, can feel rejecting, abandoning almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know that infants need something like that. They don't need to just be left. They need to be held and touched, and maybe little sounds, things that mother or attachment person says to them to help them learn what's slightly technical term, affect regulation.
As you're saying that, I also think of my dog.
Right.
When I'm out walking my dog and something happens, and often he'll look at me. He's looking for some reassurance from me.
Right. Yeah.
And if I was just silent, he wouldn't know what to do next. But if I say, it's okay,
right,
then he's okay.
Well, isn't it funny that we need to talk to our dogs and our cats? And we do.
Yes.
And it's what's implicit in our speech that the dog or the cat picks up and responds to.
Yeah, exactly. It's the energetic tone or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that could lead into neuroscience.
Okay. I'm curious. First of all, I'm very curious, especially because of everything you've said, because what you've been talking about, to me, it indicates kind of areas of psychotherapy that any therapist listening to this would probably recognize some of the things you've been talking about and some of the things that focusing adds. But also it felt, when you're talking about Jung, that there might be even a sort of a slightly transpersonal aspect to your interests. I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
But I don't hear anything that I see the link to neuroscience. So I'm curious how that got ignited for you.
Okay. Well, the reason for that is quite simple, that neuroscience is a completely different body of knowledge from psychological theory.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't fit in as another theoretical model for psychotherapy. It's something completely different. And this is a point I have to keep making again and again. And so you keep your psychological theory, and then you get this body of knowledge that goes under the title of neuroscience, but it's really about our biology. To learn our biology that underlies our psychology.
And I'm curious why you went in that direction. What
Well,
was
that's a
that?
good question. How did I go in that direction? It's something, I can't explain this, but it's something about my kind of a mind. My kind of a mind has never found philosophy very appealing and finds all the, well, most of the philosophy stuff and Gendlin's philosophy unappealing. I just don't take to it. Whereas, although I'm not a scientist, and I could never be a scientist, I do like, I always have liked science, bits of science I'm interested in. So 21 lunchtime, 25, probably more than 25 years ago, I went into Waterstone's bookshop, and Damasio's book called The Feeling of What Happens fell off the shelves into my hand. And it all started from there. And this title, The Feeling of What Happens, I thought, hello, this is up my street. And it was, because actually the way he describes what he calls the feeling of what happens from a neuroscience perspective, but also from an experience perspective, clearly he was writing from his own experience. He had to be, as well as his scientific research perspective. He was talking about felt sense. So that got me started. And then I read more Damasio, like his previous book, Descartes' Error, which has some very, very important things in it. And I went on from there. I was hooked. And now my bookshelves, there's just tons of neuroscience books.
You've already kind of touched on one of the maybe misapplications or misunderstandings of neuroscience in psychotherapy, that it isn't actually another kind of school of psychotherapy.
No.
It's something else.
Oh, yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, what are the sorts of things that you have found useful about studying neuroscience as a focusing-oriented therapist, and what are kind of maybe common misconceptions that you come across?
Well, a lot of neuroscience has made sense to me because it speaks to my experience. My focusing experience, my experience in therapy, and it starts to make sense of a lot of the, particularly the very weird stuff that happens in the therapy room. Now, there's plenty of psychological theory that goes into the same territory. For me, the neuroscience take on it is often a better explanation. There's a very good example of this, which is polyvagal theory, which everyone's heard about polyvagal theory these days, haven't they? It's Stephen Porsche. See, Stephen Porsche says that sometimes biobehavioral explanation or account of what's happening is better, so more use, than a psychological explanation. And I agree with him. And this particularly applies to trauma and trauma material. And us therapists, we psychologize everything.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's less of that in the focusing world. Not like there would be in amongst the Jungians or the Freudians or the Kleinians and whatnot. But I mean, I've been doing this for years, and other people do it. We tend to psychologize. And I think there's a place, particularly with trauma, where the psychologizing doesn't work very well. And if you look into the biology, the neurobiology, which is body as well as brain, happening, you get a better description. And so one reason that polyvagal theory has caught on is it speaks to people's experience. just like Gendlin.
Mm-hmm.
In his writing, he speaks to people's personal experience. So although there's a lot of conceptual stuff, it makes sense internally.
Could you give an example of what would be a trauma or a different example where the biological explanation makes more experiential sense?
Yeah. Well, okay. When somebody is in a highly aroused traumatic state, say in the middle of a therapy session, or they arrive to the session in that kind of state,
Mm-hmm.
the first thing we need to do is attend to their hyper aroused, probably very distressed state.
Mm-hmm.
Bring them down, settle them down.
Yeah.
Because they're in a state where focusing and the felt sense are nowhere to be found.
Yeah.
You know? They need human contact. And that's a process of helping them to calm down and come into a place where they can be inside in their bodies, and they can connect with us, the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And if you follow the sort of body-based ideas and protocols for doing that, you'll do much better. And as Alan Shaw says, psychological interpretations in a trauma state tend to be, or probably are, worse than useless. They can really mess people around.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that occurs, my experience, I've been to a couple of very big conferences that are on neuroscience with some of the big names in the sort of neurotrauma sort of world
Like
in London, like Dan
Siegel?
Yeah, Dan Siegel and Bessel van Kolk.
Van Kolk, yeah.
Yeah. And a few other people whose names I'm sure you would know, but I've forgotten. And there was a couple of things I was struck by. One was they were actually very sophisticated. They didn't think of the brain as a separate organ. They think of the brain, the body, the environment as a whole system.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned about how sometimes that gets shortened by therapists to just the brain. But they weren't doing that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I noticed is they were very, very humble in terms of their claims.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated that.
Mm.
And I thought when I read your book, I felt those things were present as well, that there's a sophistication. I mean, it needs to be read more than once because there's an awful lot in there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a nuanced perspective on this. You're not saying neuroscience should replace everything, but you are saying there is a place for it. And you have different examples of how a neuroscientific point of view can slot in to therapy very usefully.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my perspective on the example you just gave, and this is a question that comes for me, even at those conferences, I left feeling affirmed.
Right.
I didn't leave feeling like I had really learned anything new.
Uh-huh.
And even what you're saying now, I'm thinking, well, as a focusing-oriented therapist, of course we know the importance of grounding,
Mm-hmm.
of kind of being able to be with something rather than overwhelmed by it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one thing I keep coming back to is as a focusing-oriented or experiential therapist in the way that we practice,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how much of kind of the wisdom of neuroscience, even though it's in a different language, is already in the practice.
Mm. Well,
And
it might be. But it all depends.
Yeah.
Because when you say the practice,
Mhm.
everyone's practice is their own practice.
Yeah.
And the weird thing about therapy is that we don't know what goes on in other people's therapy rooms.
Mhm.
People sometimes tell stories about what goes on. And frankly, listening to those stories over the years, I've noticed that sometimes I believe them rather more than other times.
Yes.
Yeah. In other words, sometimes people told a story and I've left with a little bit of a question mark. Now, that's a felt sense thing.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a felt sense coming from my own experience and understanding of doing therapy.
Yeah.
I've been left with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, what do we mean by practice? What really happens? You see, I think one thing with neuroscience is it's still terribly early days for neuroscience and therapy.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to delve into neuroscience if they feel attracted to it. If they don't, well, fine. Don't. There is also the question of whether a basic neuroscience curriculum would fit well into therapy trainings, and I'm not aware this has ever been done.
Hmm.
And I have explained this in a piece I've written and put on my website. I haven't pushed for this because could be a very big job, and my time and energy has been taken as it is. The one thing that I do regularly is I do a one-day introduction to neuroscience at the end of the Psychosynthesis Trust's 3-year training. And I come in at the end and do this kind of neuroscience gig. And things have changed over the 15 years or so I've been doing it. People know more about neuroscience than they did, but it's very bitty. And on the whole, I'm talking a different language, and it's a big stretch of the mind for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And to really be able to use neuroscience helpfully in the therapy room, I think it needs some time. You need to sit with it and read a bit here and read somebody else there and sort of start to absorb it. The big picture is I would hope one day that some of neuroscience is taught in schools, so that people leave school understanding a bit more about our biology.
Yeah.
Let me just put in there, I had a little thing came to me when I was thinking earlier this week about our discussion today.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about our human biology. I remembered, do you know this song from the 80s, Sting? It's about the threat of nuclear war with Russia. It's a classic Sting song.
Mm-hmm.
And in that he said, there's a line, we share the same biology in the West and the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope the Russians love their children too.
Mm.
And I remember that time in the 80s when I remember going to talks and being quite convinced that there probably would be nuclear war.
Yeah.
And then Reagan and Gorbachev did a deal and the whole threat diminished. So this thing of sharing the same biology, human biology, let's understand it better, because there's better understanding these days of heart and lungs and gut. There's a lot about gut.
Mm-hmm.
And people are understanding that better, and the microbiome. Well, if we can do that, we can do the same with the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be a bloody good idea if we did understand it better, generally.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really like that idea because it's a way of teaching biology that is immediately accessible and translatable into one's own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find in yourself some of the things you're being taught, then when you see someone else that's very activated, you can understand a little bit more deeply what's happening in them because it happens in you too.
Yes, that's right. We're understanding a shared human thing. So in the therapy room,
Yeah.
by the way, I've just wound up my therapy practice after 30 years. I'm
Yeah.
officially an ex-therapist.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you. Having turned 70. Sometimes, I always did what Jung said. He said, leave your theory outside the door, engage with the person.
Yeah.
And if bits of theory sort of occur to you, then fine, they're probably may be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done that with neuroscience as well as therapy. The first thing as well as therapy theory, first thing to engage with the person, meet the person.
Yeah.
And listen and respond in the way that we know about with focusing and listening. And sometimes I found a bit of Gendlin, Gendlin theory concept would pop in. Sometimes a Jung theory would come in. Sometimes some other bit from what I've learned psychotherapy, and sometimes a bit of neuroscience would come in. So in that way, there's an equivalence, but that doesn't mean that neuroscience is another model, theoretical model for therapy, because it isn't. I don't think it should be used that way.
Okay.
And by the way, my source for saying this is Jaak Panksepp, who was, he's Mr. Affective Neuroscience. And it's only a small part of his book, which I have here, The Archaeology of Mind. And his work, I think, is crucially important. All the therapists I know who have read him, start to really, really appreciate what he's saying, because it speaks to our emotions and feelings in a way that a lot of other neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, does not. And he's still not very well known about, but it's a radically different take on neuroscience. I mean, I'll just plug in here. It's an evolutionary understanding of the mammalian nervous system and the mammalian brain that we have, as well as our dogs and cats. And I think it stands in quite a lot of contrast to a lot of other bits of neuroscience, a lot of which goes under the heading of cognitive neuroscience these days. I've tried to engage a big name neuroscientist recently about this, and I've got no response, won't engage on it. So there's something, I'm very interested in this, and it's actually, I think, quite a big issue generally in the world we live in today.
Okay, so I'm full of questions. One of which is, are you naming maybe kind of the leading edge of where you're going? But let's get to that a little bit later to see what's coming next for you, maybe, in terms of your thinking. But I'm wondering, some of the things that Gendlin said, I know this doesn't necessarily resonate for you, some of his philosophy, but some of the things that he would say philosophically is this principle of interaction first, that the relationship, the body environment are not kind of two, that somehow it's this constant interaction between the two. And I'm wondering how that fits with neuroscience, because sometimes the way it's spoken about, it can sound like it falls back into a model of a self-enclosed subject, and that there's something wrong inside of that person rather than in their way of being in a situation with other people or whatever. And I'm wondering if you address that tension in any way.
Yeah. Well, you see, I would say that Gendlin managed to write about the way our right hemispheres go about living and dealing with the world in his philosophical and experiential kind of way. So in that way, he's a complete genius to be able to do that and to write a lot and say a lot about it. And you see, it's interesting with Gendlin, because he was always rather hostile to science. I mean, he made some pretty derogatory, I've heard him say some pretty derogatory things. He's in philosophy, not science. But 2009, Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, came out. Do you know that?
Yes.
It's pretty well known.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the Bible, if you like, on the differences between the two hemispheres.
Yeah.
And Gene started writing to me. Gene picked up on it. Somebody must have told him about it. Gene picked up on it and started writing to me about, get this man, McGilchrist, tell him about focusing, you know. So I have had some contact with Ian McGilchrist over the years, and I have mentioned Gendlin and focusing. He was slightly aware of it. I didn't push it as hard as Gene wanted me to, because I didn't feel that was really appropriate. But now we have this science-based account of the difference between the hemispheres. It's science-based, but it's also from Ian's work. A lot of it was at the Maudsley in London, Maudsley Hospital, with stroke patients. Okay. That's a large part of them. When there's damage on one side of the brain and not on the other, and you see what the consequences are of that. And so the Master and His Emissary is caught on amongst a lot of people. It's got a cult following because, again, it speaks to their experience of themselves.
Yeah, that the right brain, more sort of holistic sort of way of being, is more the felt sensing version of experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have to put in my rider here. The problem with this is that inevitably we all tend to try to understand the right hemisphere and the difference between the left and the right hemispheres from a left hemisphere place.
Yeah.
Which never works. In the end, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. But we, particularly we focusers, know a lot about how the right hemisphere works because of our focusing experience. And that's true for anyone who's done a lot of inner work, inner reflective work, whether it's focusing or something else. From our own experience, we know it.
Yeah. Can I just ask about that? Because I think an example of that could be when I'm teaching therapists, for example, about focusing, it is very difficult to encourage them not to keep trying to pin it down and label something, or just, come to a conclusion about something, or transpose it back into some theoretical term, and lose the kind of the ongoing process aspect of it. Is that part of what you're meaning?
Absolutely, yeah. That's part of the skill of being a therapist.
Yeah.
But also to know how, when and how to use a psychological concept, for example, that might be helpful for the client in relating to their inner experience and what to do with it.
Yeah.
And you can only learn that, you can only do that from a false sense place. Yeah. So you've got to practice, haven't you? You've got to experiment, you've got to learn from experience. And the more experience that you have, the luckier you get. Yeah. That's a throwaway phrase. You flesh out your felt sense of how to doing this kind of work, so you're in a better place and maybe feel more confident. So sometimes I mean, this is how I worked as a therapist. I did bring concepts and theories in, but I was always checking myself for when not to do that, but to make an experiential response. Or whatever I said, I was trying to find a way to put the person back to themselves, back to their felt sense.
Yeah.
And sometimes something conceptual was what was required to send people back to their felt sense. Well, how does that sit with me? Does that ring true for me? Yeah.
So it's using theory, whatever the theory might be, or the term, the concept, in an experiential way. You're wanting to see, does it resonate?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. So it's bringing that into the the dialogue
Yeah.
between client and therapist, and the therapist offering what they can, what they feel might be helpful, trying things out. One of the things I felt about, what I noticed about focusing over the years, and probably applied to focusing oriented therapy, is there's a tendency, I think, for the therapist, the focuser, to focusing person, and it might be the listener in a partnership, to hand over too much to the person who's focusing, or they want to be focusing, and retreating too much themselves. There are two felt senses in the room, one for the client and one for the therapist. And it's the therapist's responsibility to listen to their felt sense and to draw on anything and everything that they can sort of channel through their felt sense. And this thing of staying out of the way of the client's process, I don't really buy it. Get in there in the client's process, engage.
Yeah.
And, you know, the big difference can be stated quite simply, can't it? Instead of the therapist being the expert, as in the classic sort of idea of psychoanalysis, the therapist is somebody who's has learned a bunch of stuff, more than probably the client has, and can offer things at appropriate time. And that's part of the kind of service that a therapist offers. That's my view.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I know one of the objections to that certainly comes up when I'm teaching is that's too directive. And that there's this kind of worshiping of this fantasy of being non-directive, as though the moment you sit across from a client, your presence is already directive just because you're there.
Yeah.
But can I just ask what you've just described, which I agree with, is there a neuroscience basis for that, the importance of that? I'd love to hear that, because that's...
Well, it's quite simple. Our right hemispheres are putting together the outer world and the inner world all the time.
Okay.
The outer world includes the other person.
Yeah.
You and I are doing that now.
Yeah.
Client and therapist are doing that.
Yeah.
So that we all have a sense of self and a sense of the other. And they're all mixed in a way that our left hemispheres cannot pin down and define, and can't really get it, can't really describe very well. You have to experience it, but it's a very fundamental human experience. People just have to sort of hear about and find their way to it.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
And you see that's where a lot of neuroscience it completely dovetails with Gendlin's thinking, and can be a big support to what we do. Of course, anybody can take neuroscience, find a bit of neuroscience to support what they do and what they like doing. So CBT can do that very easily, and that's fine. That's the way it is. But there's if the cognitive approaches can harness neuroscience for what they do, well, focusing oriented approaches, more emotionally based, experientially based approaches to therapy can harness neuroscience as well. And in my view, even more, because it brings in the whole nervous system, the body, as well as the brain, and the two hemispheres. I hope one day people will be more familiar with the difference between the hemispheres and be easier to talk about.
Yeah.
It's a huge step in psychology. It's huge.
I guess it's the case that if anything is actually happening in therapy, no matter what kind of therapy, that there has to be a biological correlate.
Yes.
Yeah, every moment of it, there's something happening biologically, as well as whatever else.
And a good distinction there goes back to Gendlin's theory of personality change. Is it what's happening merely talking about or thinking about or rearranging things in, mental filing cabinets, or is it really experienced, really felt?
Yeah.
Really versus really, it's brilliant.
Yeah. I'm just aware of time. The
Yes.
time is going quickly.
Yeah.
And I know in addition to neuroscience that you have been involved in sort of other areas of development of the focusing world and FOT practice and stuff. I'm wondering what else is going on or what else you'd like to be sort of involved in or passionate about.
Right. Passionate about, yeah. Well, I'm big into felt sense these days.
Okay.
So I've started a bloggy thing on my website, felt sense notes, writing things about felt sense. I think felt sense is, it may be a great contribution of Gendlin to the world than focusing, because focusing sort of suggests you've got to sit down and learn this thing. Focusing, felt sense is all over the place, and sometimes I want to challenge focusers' appreciation of the felt sense. That's one thing, because I think there's more to it than some people appreciate. One of the reason why it's such a brilliant concept is that it comes with a practice. The concept and the practice are intertwined, which is maybe unusual for this sort of thing. And it helps us to understand in the inner world of the right hemisphere, which is also the inner world of what Freud and Jung call psyche. Well, and people before them, of course, because psyche comes from Greek. It's a very, very powerful concept, and I feel there's a lot to do with it, and I want to write a book about it.
Oh.
And I think there are avenues here for taking the appreciation of felt sense and what we can do with that into all sorts of fields, way beyond where we've gone with focusing so far.
Different applications of it.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what sort of applications do you immediately think of and are interested in?
Well, I think this is in the background for me all the time these days. Certainly working in a group context, working in an organizational context, how we run the world, how they run the world.
Yeah.
Because we live in a world that, as Ian McGilchrist says, is very left hemisphere biased at the moment.
Yeah.
G. Gendlin would say it's very unit model driven. And that is very, very problematic. I mean, it's so problematic, the human race is on course to pretty much destroy itself. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
We're just destroying our environment.
Yeah.
And we don't have to do that. It doesn't need to be like this, but it is very challenging. And I think the situation we find ourselves in collectively is very, very challenging. I think felt sense is, well, for me, it's potentially a really useful organizing principle, if you like, which I feel I can do all kinds of things with it. And that's what I want to do. And let me give an example of that.
Yeah.
I'm, of course, as probably we all are, very exercised by what's happening in Israel and Gaza at the moment.
Yeah.
And we know there are very, very tricky issues there if we start talking about it. Well, what I've been doing is going back to my felt sense to see what I want to say. And sometimes my felt sense says, just stay clear of it. Diversion, don't need to go there. Sometimes it says, say something about it. Because if I didn't, I feel I would be left with the feeling of having avoided avoided it and sort of suppressed something that's difficult and uncomfortable,
Mhm.
but that is certainly part of my daily experience at the moment.
Yeah, that's something in your felt sense in order to remain sort of open to your own integrity, it requires some kind of an expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the felt sense, we need the felt sense. Anybody needs the felt sense to, for example, be able to say something in the world that would keep, well, not necessarily keep, but would stand a chance of keeping both Israelis and Palestinians on side. They could live with it.
Yeah, exactly.
That is very difficult to do, but is possible from a felt sense place.
So I just want to ask about groups. This is how you could imagine, what teaching felt sensing to groups so that they're more subtly attuned to their experience with each other or listening to each other's experience?
Well, I would like to do this. I haven't done it yet. I've used groups of focusers to play with some of
Okay.
ideas and ways of interacting in groups. And I've learned some things, particularly from the European focusing meetings.
Yes.
I've written about it. I've got a piece coming out in the next BFA newsletter about this, and I'm really interested to hear other people input on it. So I sort of have this idea of work I'd like to do in the future, but whether it'll materialize, I don't know.
I mean, I know that you have taken in the past a leadership role in the focusing world, um, on the board or of the institute.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a leadership role.
Okay. Okay.
Consultative role.
Okay. Consultative role. Um, when you talk about organizations and the felt sense, are you kind of interested in developing organizations that somehow put this at the center of how they organize?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really an open-ended inquiry for all of us into, well, how do we do this?
Yeah.
What ways of working organizationally fit with felt sense, and which ways tend not to?
Yeah. Yeah. I've been vexed by that question for years and I'm very curious about it.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's Tiffy. What about the climate change organizations in this country?
Mhm.
Because I see, read, and hear about a lot of stuff, and I think this is not the way to do it.
Mhm.
No, no, no.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I would like to, my plans once we move to Devon is to get a little bit more involved in green and climate change groups, and to maybe take some of these ideas and ways of doing things in there and see what happens.
That sounds fantastic. And I'm sure there's other people in the focusing world that would come alongside you on that mission. Um, from my experience is that even as focusers, like in environmental groups, most of those people don't know focusing. So they would somehow need to develop that sensitivity in some way.
Yeah.
But even in the focusing world, that there comes a point where we kind of jettison in some way our contact with felt sensing as a potential way to organize and make decisions together and kind of leap to some traditional way
Mm-hmm.
and kind of give up on it ourselves. And I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
maybe yes, we probably do, and I think it's very easy to do it without realizing we're doing it.
incredibly easy to do it just in a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and isn't that a thing with this whole way of approaching things, that we keep losing it?
Hmm.
I mean, I keep losing my felt sense, but I know to find it again.
Yeah.
But I'm
Exactly.
not going to, I can't stay there all the time. You
Yeah.
know, it's not perfect. I keep losing it, but I find my way back, and I do. And these days, I can find my way back generally quite quickly.
Hmm.
One of the problems with the whole felt sense way of approaching things, and maybe generally focusing, is that it's not perfect.
Yeah.
We don't get a perfect world. We get a messy human world,
Yeah.
but it's a world that's capable of evolving, changing, adapting
Hmm.
to like environmental changes. Um, but you can't pin it down the way the left hemisphere
Yeah.
or the unit model approach wants to pin it down.
Yeah.
Put a computer system around it. Um, it just doesn't work that way. And
Yeah.
I'm increasingly alarmed at our not so much our reliance on computer systems, not just our own computers, but dealing with organizations that run around their computer system.
Yeah.
But our lack of awareness of what it's doing to us and how our sort of tolerance of the dehumanizing aspects of living in a world that is increasingly run by computer systems.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really alarming.
Yes. Fascinating. I want to go back to one last thing that you said before we finish. Um, you were saying that even in the focusing world, that there's, I can't remember how you said it, but like an underappreciation of what the felt sense actually is.
Yeah. That's that's a statement I'm willing to hang my hat on. Of course, it's a generalization
Yeah.
because focusing world is a bunch of individuals.
Yeah.
Um, but for example, you see, this is why I found neuroscience and Ian McGilchrist's work really, really helpful.
Hmm.
There is this tendency to be a bit over literal about the body,
Hmm.
and keep talking about, listening to the body. Yes, we do listen to the body, but I think we overdo it sometimes. And I think what we're really doing in focusing is switching from a left hemisphere attention mode to a right hemisphere attention mode. And the easy way to do that is to center your awareness in your body. And then it opens up this whole very different world of the right hemisphere, which is such a wonderful relief from all the left hemisphere driven stuff
Hmm.
that we inevitably do and get involved in living our daily lives. So if we could understand that we're talking about what in my book, I say is a right brain and body ensemble.
Hmm.
It's one thing. Think of it as one thing working together.
Yeah.
So you don't have to get over obsessed with your physical sensations in your body or where in your body.
Hmm.
That's valuable to some extent, but only to some extent.
Yeah.
Just allow your attention to center in your body. I think there are a lot of places we can go where maybe we haven't been so far.
Let me ask one last question. The second last question. Um, because when you say that, I'm reminded of one of the things you emphasize in your book, which is, I think it comes from McGilchrist, where you're talking about the right brain, if I remember correctly, being kind of almost like holding the background, the larger picture of things, and the left brain being more foreground.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if in the focusing process, for example, if I'm in touch with a felt sense, it has that holistic sense to it. It feels like it has in it more than I could ever pin down or say. And yet there's moments where it kind of focuses into something more like a foreground sort of word or memory or something that, and the whole body kind of responds and there's a shift. And I'm wondering if at that moment, the background and the foreground, the left and the right, are working together and sort of communicating with each other. The problem then is when the focuser grabs what came as a word or something and wants to hold on to it rather than opening up to the whole process again.
Yes. Well, I think what you're describing there, that whole shift that comes, that's a right hemisphere, a right brain biased or dominant sort of process.
Yeah.
And the right brain is dominant for emotional arousal in the body and in the brain, of course. So in letting go to what wants to happen from inside, that arousal drops down, which then releases whatever wants to come, maybe tears, maybe things, words that we haven't said before. And there's that process. And then, of course, the left hemisphere at some point, and maybe quite early on, wants to, as you say, grab it, grasp it.
Yeah.
And McDouglas makes this point that the left hemisphere is biased for grasping not only my tea mug, but for grasping concepts and ideas.
Yes.
And that's, as we know, it can happen in focusing. People get too hooked on and then sort of go off on a mental trip. So part of learning the art of focusing is it not, that including the left hemisphere, articulating some of it, but keep coming back to the new felt sense that's there, having said that. Sometimes I only come back quite later on because my left hemisphere has suddenly got so much to say. It wants to say it, it wants to write it. So I let it go. Fine, do that.
Yeah.
Then you've got to come back and see where you're at then, and maybe what the left hemisphere wrote is can be improved. But we need our left brains to speak articulately and to write articulately. And you know, one of the interesting things in focusing, and you can look out for this, is when the words come from the right hemisphere, words come from the left. Normally, our speaking comes from the left hemisphere, like I'm doing now, properly organized sentences. But sometimes in focusing, people say ungrammatical things. Gendlin was always good about saying, don't worry about the grammar. Just say maybe just a word, a few words, maybe something that doesn't make obvious sense, but it feels right to say it. That's even sort of gibberish. Well, that's probably a bit rude on it, but not really gibberish. It just has that feeling about it. This is not something that I would publish, probably not something I'd publish as a poem, although it might get closer because poetry is a more right hemisphere oriented use of language. Maybe, if you like, a more balanced left and right, whereas a lot of our writing is very inevitably very left hemisphere oriented. I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense to me. Often at the end of a focusing session, I will want to come up with a sentence that I can take away that will remind the body of what the feeling was. And it takes me quite a while to get the right words. And if anyone else read that sentence, they would not get anything from it at all.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And see, that's, we won't have time to go into TAE, but a criticism I would have of the of TAE is that I think it's too much prone to people coming up with a lot of stuff, saying stuff, writing stuff that makes sense to them, but it's not going to have much impact on the world.
Yeah.
And if you want to impact the world, you need to start with that, with what's come from your TAE process, and rewrite it with the help of the other side of your brain in a way that's going to resonate with other people, which of course is perfectly possible because we use both sides of our brain. We can tap into the general zeitgeist of the use of language and what's going to connect, what we hope it's going to connect with.
But it's like there is a translation process there.
Yeah, a bit of a further, you know, I'm not sure it's actually translation. It's just the next stage of working with the language. So you say something that people can, you know, anyone potentially can start to get their head around and understand it. You know, Gene's writing varies, doesn't it? Because some of what he writes, I think, is very accessible, and some of what he writes is very not accessible. You have to be a focusing philosophy fan to spend a lot of time with it.
Yeah.
But I don't think his process model book is going to have a big impact in the world. But what people can do with process model, or with something like that, maybe can have more of an impact, maybe is having more of an impact. Now, if somebody wants to challenge me on that, please challenge me.
It's interesting. I mean, I know we have to finish, but I just want to say it reminds me that my impression, rightly or wrongly, is that for philosophers to understand Gene's philosophy or a process model, they need to know focusing for themselves. Otherwise, like you say, they will either take it in some public language way, or they will just not get it at all.
Yeah. Do you know, that's like when you teach an introductory weekend workshop in focusing. People start saying things, oh, this is like something else.
Yeah.
Now, what I've learned to do there is to ride with that, not to sort of say, well, actually, it's not like that, something else. But the person is sort of making links in their own mind. If they want to think like something else for now, that's fine. But let's keep going. And probably as they experience more focusing and think more about it and talk with other people more about it, they'll see that, well, it's not just this other thing, it's something special in itself. And I should have recorded tons of things over the years of what people have said on introductory workshops, because it's fascinating. It describes this sort of process very well.
Well,
okay.
There's more we could say.
Yeah. But yeah, let's not ramble on forever.
Yeah, I found it very fascinating. Interesting to hear some kind of focusing experience sort of reimagined and understood, if that's a word. Re-understood in more kind of neurobiological terms. It's very interesting.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Greg. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
Okay, good luck.
Right.